Hi, this is Tara. Today, let's study the fourth sutra. What does it say? vṛttisārūpyamitaratra. vṛttisārūpyamitaratra. What does this mean? Vritti, as you know, is modification. Sārupyam is identification with form. And itaratra means the other state. So what is the problem of Sutra 4? Okay. Firstly, what it means is, according to Maharishi Ved Vyasa, is there is conformity to the functions in the other state. So, it's basically the second part of the question that was raised in the third sutra. What was the question raised in the third sutra? So, let's say I'm a great yogi. I have overcome chitta. I am in nirudha. I am in swarupa. And what does Purusa do now? Because there is no identification, there is no cognition of rajas, sattva and tamas, there is no distinction. So what does Purusa do? And the answer came, Purusa is established in the self. Okay, fine, Purusa is established in the self. Now the second question, which is, if Purusa is established in the self, what is the state of the spirit in the waking state? Right? That was when all the vrittis had ceased. But in the waking state, when I have to eat, when I have to walk, when I have to go to work, when I have to function, what is the state of spirit? And the answer arises, in the waking state, the spirit is identified with the functions of the mind. To be precise, Maharishi Ved Vyasa says, the mind is like a magnet energized by nearness alone. Because of the proximity to Purusa, okay? Being seen, it becomes the possession of his Lord Purusa. So basically, Purusa is in charge. He is the puppeteer now, and the mind is the puppet. The mind is held like a magnet by the spirit, and through its power of perception becomes swa, or the property of the spirit. In this seamless relationship, the mind functions become apparent. So while earlier you were subject to sattva, tamas and rajas, and you were subject to chitta, you were subject to mano, buddhi, ahankara. Now all of that is in your control. Swami Satyananda says, or in the control of Purusa. When not abiding in its essential nature, what happens to Purusa or the self or soul? Then the patterns are superimposed on the soul. Wrong identification, like when we experience the emotions played on a screen during a movie, though we are only witnessing consciousness. Purusa, we identify with chitta and its modifications. So for instance, you watch a movie and you might cry. You're not really experiencing the things there, but you identify with it. In that way, there is detachment, but there is also identification. At other times, the seer is identified with the modifications. If I'm in a state of sorrow and someone blames me, this becomes a modification vritti and I identify with it. The result is misery. So in the waking state, if Purusa is going to identify with the issues, the arising circumstances of the sense organs, the sensory inputs and the sense objects, then again you're going to go back into misery. BKS Iyengar translates it as, at other times, the seer identifies with fluctuating consciousness. This is a very important translation, because what he says is, when the seer identifies with the sense objects or the consciousness of perception, he forgets his original splendorous state. So what BKS Iyengar is saying is, you can be a yogi, you can overcome chitta, you can attain swarupa and nirudha, you can be in a state of ekagra, and still, if Purusa identifies with the sense objects, you can forget who you are. The nature of consciousness is to perceive a sense object, identify with it, and draw the seer towards it. Thus the seer becomes engrossed in the object. Intelligence diversifies from here. The soul doesn't dwell in its own glory. Thinking has manifested instead of the soul. So the minute you say you're in waking state, the seer has identified with the sense object. That's the only way you can be in waking state. The imprint of the objects get imprinted on chitta, which projects onto sense objects in order to identify with them. Its nature becomes volatile as it changes to identify with the sense objects perceived. So somebody has come and said, eat only if I'm identifying with the body, with hunger, with food, with taste, with smell, with attachment to the person who's feeding me. Only so automatically your Purusha has identified with the sense objects. Consumed by sense objects, we identify with, we are only aware on a day-to-day basis with the upper side of the lens. In contact with the world, it becomes opaque, dirty, and forgets the inner source of self-radiance. To be in the waking state, to interact with the world, is to forget who you are. So this is why, if you remember in, I think the introduction of Sutra 1, Barbara Stoller-Miller basically makes this distinction between how Krishna teaches yoga and how Patanjali teaches yoga. And Krishna's approach is more practical. It's how to fight in the world. But Patanjali says there is no chance for interaction with the world. The minute you interact with the world, you've lost your Siddha Prajna. So you are basically, miring the Purusha back into Prakriti. So there's no either or with Patanjali. Osho says, in the other states there is identification with the modifications of the mind. When you're not established in witnessing, in all other states you identify with the mind. You identify with the flow of thoughts, emotions, sensory perceptions, sense objects. Even the Buddha or Patanjali feel hunger, Osho points out. But they will never say, I am hungry. They would say, the body feels hunger. Patanjali would remain an observer. Once you identify, you cease to be a witness and become one with the thought. Yoga is cessation of mind. When the mind ceases, you are established in witnessing self. If you are in identification, you are in the world, in misery, and you have not transcended samsara. Barbara Stoller-Miller says, otherwise, the observer identifies with the turnings of thought. And again, here she uses turnings of thought, which is a very Buddhist phrase, turn of phrase. She uses the fourth aphorism as a lead-in to the Sutra 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, which are an interesting set, which explain the turnings of thoughts. That's why she uses that phrase over here. Since the observer in Sutra 3 is established in witnessing, it is the natural counter that if you are not established in witnessing, you are established in identifying with chitta and vritti, that is thought, emotion, perception, and that which is perceived. And that is what she explains in the coming sutras. Thank you for listening. This was Sutra number 4. Come back for Sutra 5.